The coaster slid to the edge of table 12 just as the woman in the black dress looked up and smiled. Cormac Vale read the 2 words as he walked past. Help. Table 12. He didn't stop. He counted 41 people in the room, 3 exits, 2 men wearing their coats indoors, and 1 young woman who hadn't touched her plate all evening. Across from her, a silver-haired man rested his hand on her wrist, the way a person holds a small bird. The hand wasn't squeezing. It was simply there. Cormac took 4 more steps, then stopped in the middle of the carpeted hallway. Beyond the glass, 41 floors up, an ice storm was burying the city of Chicago in white. He turned around. The woman had pulled the coaster back, set her wine glass down on top of it, and was smiling at the silver-haired man. A beautiful smile. The smile of someone who has just been told something amusing. Only her left hand, hidden beneath the table, was clutching the fabric of her dress until the knuckles went white. In his life, Cormac Vale had watched people beg, watched people lie, watched people go down on their knees, but he had never watched anyone put out their own call for help and then smile about it. If this story moved you, please leave a like, share it with someone you thought of just now, drop us a comment with what you felt, and subscribe to our channel for the stories still to come. Cormac returned to the private room at the end of the corridor, where 2 attorneys and a city councilman were waiting for him on a set of brown leather chairs. He took off his coat, handed it to the attendant, then sat down without saying a word for nearly a minute. Fitz Brannigan stood nearby with his hands in his pockets, waiting. He had worked for Cormac long enough to know that when the boss was silent, it was best not to fill that silence with words. Table 12, Cormac finally said. Tell me. Fitz glanced toward the spill of light beyond the curtain and took a few breaths before answering. Gideon Marsh. Commercial real estate, mostly on the north side of the city. He has a charitable foundation in his name. He sits on the board of trustees at Mercy Northside Hospital. Fitz lowered his voice, and he put 38% of the capital into Riverline. Cormac's expression didn't change. Riverline was 10 years of his life. It was the thing that would turn money with a smell on it into money with paperwork. Turn a name people spoke in whispers into a name people printed on signs. 38% was a number large enough to earn a seat at the table with him, and large enough to walk away from that table whenever the man chose. And the girl, Cormac said. Fitz shrugged. Somebody's secretary from Halloway and Stroud. Carries a notebook, pours water, takes minutes. He paused. Not someone worth remembering, boss. Cormac turned the plain steel ring on his finger once, then stopped. She's wearing a borrowed dress. Fitz blinked. How do you know? The shoulders are about 2 centimeters too wide for her frame. The seam across the back is pulled tight because someone altered it in a hurry. Cormac kept staring at the wall in front of him, as though he could still see that table through 3 layers of partitions. The shoes are half a size too big. She walks on the balls of her feet to keep the heels from slipping off. There's paper stuffed into the left toe. Fitz said nothing. The attendant brought the liquor, set it down, and left. A person who spends her own money on shoes buys ones that fit, Cormac said. A person who borrows them endures the pain for 3 hours without complaining. He lifted the glass but didn't drink. She isn't a guest. She's something they brought along with them. The city councilman gave a light laugh, thinking it was a joke. No one joined him. Fitz looked at his boss and realized something he didn't like at all. Throughout that entire evening, Cormac Vale hadn't looked anyone in that private room in the eye for more than 2 seconds. Near midnight, Cormac's black car stopped in front of a cold storage warehouse in the Southern Harbor District. Snow covered the corrugated metal roof, and cold air poured from the open doorway like white smoke. Inside, a foreman named Doyle sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the narrow aisle, both hands resting on his thighs, neither tied nor restrained. He had been skimming money from the dockworkers' union for half a year, a little each week, small enough that no one had bothered to count. Cormac didn't shout. He dragged over a plastic crate, sat down across from him, and placed a thick stack of papers on top of it. Doyle looked down, and his face went gray. Inside that stack was every debt he owed: loan papers, mortgage documents, bank names, account balances, and even the things he had believed no one knew. Cormac took a matchbook from his coat pocket. He struck one match, touched the flame to the corner of the papers, then set them down on the wet concrete floor. The 2 men sat together and watched the fire slowly eat its way from the edges toward the center, yellow light flickering across the steel walls around them. Neither of them spoke until nothing remained but ash. I've held on to that for half a year, Cormac said. I haven't used it. I don't intend to. He stood and brushed off his sleeves. Your house, your wife, your kids, I don't touch them. That's not how I do business. But you pay their money back before Friday, and you walk yourself out of my harbor. Do you understand? Doyle nodded. He understood. He understood more clearly than he would have if someone had threatened him, because a man willing to burn the very thing that could destroy you was a man who didn't need it. Cormac reached the door, then stopped. Outside, the snow was still falling heavily, and the cranes stood motionless like iron skeletons against the dull sky. He slipped a hand into the inside pocket of his coat. The paper coaster was still there, its edge slightly curled from the moisture. He didn't take it out. He only let the tips of his fingers rest against the stiff cardboard, then stepped out into the cold. About 10 hours before that night on the 41st floor, Sloane Whitaker sat at her desk on the 22nd floor of a building no one ever bothered to remember the name of, typing the final page of a 34-page set of minutes. She was 27 years old. She had worked as an executive assistant at the law firm Halloway & Stroud for 6 years. For those 6 years, her job had been to write down other people's words, meeting minutes, correspondence, notes in the margins, things people said and then forgot. She kept for them, numbering the pages, binding them, filing them away in cabinets. Thousands of pages of words had probably passed through her hands. Not a single page belonged to her. That morning, Preston Halloway called her into his office and closed the door behind her. He didn't sit in his chair. Instead, he leaned against the edge of his desk, with his arms folded across his chest, the posture of a man about to ask for a favor rather than give an order. He told her there was a dinner downtown that evening, that Mr. Marsh was an old-fashioned sort of man, the kind who liked having someone at the table taking notes, liked the feeling that when he spoke, someone was writing it down. Just take the minutes, he said. 2 hours, and there would be a car to take her home. Sloane stood straight, both hands holding her notebook against her stomach. She told him she had to go to the hospital that evening, that she had an appointment with the physician on duty. Halloway nodded slowly, pretending to consider it, then asked a question that made her fall silent. He asked how Toby had been lately. He used the boy's actual name, not your brother, not that boy at home, but Toby, neat and familiar, like an uncle who belonged at the family table. That was exactly what made Preston Halloway more dangerous than all the loud men she had ever sat and taken minutes for. He never threatened anyone. He simply remembered names. Then he looked out the window and added, in the light voice of someone commenting on the weather, that the Marsh Foundation funded the entire pediatric cardiology program at Mercy Northside Hospital, that Mr. Marsh cared very deeply about things like that. Sloane understood. She said she would go. She returned to her desk, opened a drawer, took out her notary seal, and slipped it into her purse, because there were certain dinners where people ended up needing one. That notary certificate was the only thing she had left from the 2 years of law school she had never finished. She dropped out one winter night when she was 21, the night she lost both her father and her mother, and she had never gone back. But when she applied to Halloway & Stroud, Halloway himself had told her to keep it, to renew it regularly. A secretary with a notary seal was so convenient for the office, he had said. No need to go looking for someone outside every time an urgent document needed to be notarized. For 6 years, she had renewed it on time, every single year, and never once imagined that one day that small piece of paperwork would become so valuable to someone else. That afternoon, she left the office half an hour earlier than usual, so she could stop by Marisol's desk in accounting and borrow a black dress and a pair of shoes. Marisol was taller than she was, with longer legs too, but those were the only things in the building formal enough for a dinner on the 41st floor. When she arrived, Sloane went into the women's restroom, shut herself inside a stall, tore off a small piece of paper, folded it into quarters, and pushed it into the toe of the left shoe to keep her foot from sliding. It was the second piece. She had put the first one in back at the office. She went to the sink, turned on the faucet, and held both hands beneath the warm water for a long while until they stopped trembling. Beyond the glass at the end of the corridor, the city was slowly disappearing into a murky white haze, and the lights below had already begun to blur behind the ice. Sloane raised her eyes and looked at herself in the mirror. The face staring back looked tired and strangely unfamiliar. She lifted the corners of her mouth. No, she let them fall, took a breath, then tried again. Still not right. She stood there practicing until the face in the mirror finally agreed to smile with her. A smile warm enough, natural enough, the smile of someone who had just heard something amusing. Then she dried her hands, held the notebook against her chest, and stepped out into the corridor. Table 12 stood beside the glass wall, and throughout the entire evening, Sloane sat with her back to the dining room, facing Gideon Marsh in a light gray suit. His silver hair combed neatly back, gold links fastened at his cuffs. He said her name 4 times. The first was when he introduced her to the server, the second when he told her to write down a number, the third when he asked whether she thought the snow was beautiful, and the fourth when he told her she should try the fish. Not once in those 4 times did he look her in the eye. He looked into his wineglass, out through the window, down at his own hands, but never at her. Sloane had taken minutes in enough conference rooms to understand that when a man remembered your name without looking at you, it wasn't because he was being polite. He talked at length about charity, about the children on waiting lists, about this city, he said. This city that had forgotten what kindness looked like, where everyone was busy, everyone was rushing, and no one was willing to sit down anymore and care for somebody else. Preston Halloway laughed in the right places, nodded at the right moments, and occasionally added a word of praise just brief enough to be useful. At the far end of the table sat a 4th man named Royce Nadeau, slightly withdrawn from the candlelight, his coat still on, his plate untouched, and for the entire 2 hours he didn't say a single word. Sloane wrote down everything Marsh said in her notebook, carefully, completely, even the things that meant nothing. She had learned that as long as her hand kept moving, people tended to leave her alone. Then, in the middle of some story about a winter years ago, Marsh reached across the table and placed his hand over her wrist. He didn't squeeze. His hand simply rested there, warm and dry, heavy enough that she could no longer keep writing. "You have the hands of someone who knows how to write," he said. Sloane didn't pull away. She had spent 6 years sitting in rooms like this, and she understood something no one had taught her during her 2 years of law school, that pulling your hand away was an answer too, and the wrong answer always had a price that was never paid by the person who gave the answer, but by someone else. She left her hand beneath his and thanked him. Marsh nodded, satisfied, then announced that he had 3 days of work in New Buffalo that weekend, by the lake, where the air was wonderful, and Preston had told him she was free. He said it in the easy tone of a man inviting friends away for a vacation. Sloane set down her pen. She told him she had a younger brother in the hospital, that she had an appointment with the doctor, that she couldn't go. Marsh smiled, a smile so gentle that anyone watching from the next table would have assumed he had just said something kind. He told her, of course he knew all about it. The boy's file had been moved to priority status that very morning, something he himself had approved before leaving his office. Then he tapped the back of her hand twice, evenly, the way someone might tap the lid of a box after closing it. "You see," he said, "I always take care of my people." Beyond the glass, the snow was slowly erasing the streets below, and Sloane sat perfectly still in that moment, understanding with absolute clarity, with no hope left to soften it, that she wasn't going home tonight. She kept her right hand resting neatly on the table, natural and composed, as though waiting for the next instruction. Her left hand slipped beneath the edge of the table and drew the pen out of her palm. A little while later, everyone at the table stood. Marsh put on his coat. Nadeau rose first and headed toward the elevators, and Halloway took her thin gray sweater from the server and handed it to her with both hands, careful and courteous, as though he were returning a gift. Sloane put it on. The sweater wasn't warm enough for a night like this, and all 4 people at that table knew it. She held the notebook against her chest and followed them into the corridor, her chin slightly raised, her eyes straight ahead. When she passed the man in the black wool coat standing at the far end of the hallway, she didn't turn her head, didn't slow her steps, and only said very softly, so softly that he alone could hear her, "You haven't seen anything yet." Then the elevator doors closed in front of her. The elevator doors had already closed, but Cormac remained standing at the far end of the corridor for a while before turning back toward table 12. The staff were clearing away the dishes. 3 plates had been partly eaten, but hers remained untouched, the piece of white fish still resting in the center of a sauce that had gone cold and congealed into a dull film. Her wineglass was missing exactly 1 sip. He reached out and lifted it. Beneath it lay the cardboard coaster, and the ring of moisture from the bottom of the glass had left a wet circle directly across the 2 words, blurring the edges of the ink but not erasing them. The handwriting was careful, and even the handwriting of someone accustomed to writing things for other people to read. Cormac brushed away the moisture with his thumb, waited for it to dry a little, then folded the cardboard in half and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. The server watched him but didn't ask. In a place like this, people were paid not to ask questions. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual and turned on every news channel while he made coffee. There was nothing. Weather, snow, a multi-vehicle crash on the Western Highway, a press conference about the school budget. He told Fitz to call someone they knew at the police department. No report had been filed under the name Whitaker. No one had called the emergency line during the night. Near noon, Fitz showed him a job posting on an employment site, uploaded early that morning. Holloway and Stroud was urgently seeking an executive assistant. Shorthand proficiency required. Applicants with a notary commission preferred. Immediate start. Cormac read the posting again and again, and felt something cold travel down the back of his neck, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He had lived long enough in this city to understand its rules. If a person with money disappeared, the whole country would know before breakfast. There would be press conferences, enlarged photographs, hotlines. If a secretary disappeared, the only things left behind were an empty chair and a job posting for her replacement. No one called the police because no one thought there was anything worth calling about. She was gone. People left all the time. Early that afternoon, he went to the building and up to the 22nd floor. Preston Holloway came all the way to the door to greet him, shook his hand with both of his, called him Mr. Vale, offered him coffee, offered him a seat, said what an honor it was, that he could hardly believe a man as busy as Cormac had found time to visit that day. Cormac sat down and asked about the assistant who had taken minutes at dinner the night before. Holloway laughed, waved one hand dismissively, and said she had taken personal leave. Some family matter. Young people were like that these days. When they wanted time off, they simply took it. Cormac didn't answer. He was looking past Holloway's shoulder, through the doorway behind him, where a coat hook held a thin gray sweater with a round neckline, slightly worn at the elbows. He stared at it long enough that Holloway had to turn and look too. In this city, in the middle of winter, no one took personal leave and left her sweater hanging in her boss's office. Cormac reached into his inside pocket, took out the coaster, unfolded it flat, and placed it on the glass desk, turning the two words toward the man across from him. Holloway looked down. For one brief instant, no longer than a single breath, all the blood drained from his face. He recognized the handwriting. For 6 years he had read that handwriting every day across page after page of meeting minutes. Then he smiled, and the smile returned so quickly that if Cormac had blinked, he would have missed it. Holloway said she liked to joke around, that she was a funny girl, that it was probably some little prank with her friends. Cormac didn't ask another question. He picked up the piece of cardboard, folded it, put it back into his pocket, stood, buttoned his coat from the bottom upward, and walked toward the door. Holloway called after him, inviting him to stay and finish his coffee. Cormac didn't turn around. Down in the lobby, Fitz was waiting beside the car, both shoulders of his coat covered in snow. On the way toward the parking area, Fitz said plainly what he had been thinking since the night before. Marsh held 38% of Riverline. Going after him meant the project collapsed, meant 10 years of work went straight into the river, meant 400 jobs at the southern harbor disappeared before spring, and meant the Vale name remained forever on the wrong side of the sign. Fitz added that he understood what happened the night before was ugly, but it was somebody else's business. Cormac opened the car door, paused for a moment, and answered in the low, even voice Fitz knew so well. If he can do this to his own people, he can do it to me. Then he got into the car and shut the door. That afternoon, Cormac returned to the 41st floor while the restaurant was still empty, just as the staff were beginning to spread tablecloths across the tables. The coat check stood immediately to the left of the entrance, a narrow little space behind a polished wooden counter, and the woman working there was an elderly lady with short silver hair, thin framed glasses, and a burgundy uniform vest. The name tag on her chest read Bertie Kowalski. He asked her about table 12 the night before. She didn't need even a second to think. She said the silver-haired man had arrived first, alone, and checked a camel hair overcoat. The tall, thin man in the brown suit came about 10 minutes later. The girl arrived last, taking the east elevator, and she hadn't checked a coat at all. She only had a gray sweater draped over one arm, and she kept it with her the entire time. Bertie said the man who never removed his coat hadn't handed her anything either. He had simply stood beside the second column and watched the elevator doors. She said that when they left, the silver-haired man collected his coat first. The girl walked between them, and a car had already been waiting downstairs in the garage for quite some time, a dark-colored car whose license plate she recited clearly, letter by letter and number by number, and the driver's name was Dell, a man who often came upstairs to collect things for guests. Cormac wrote it all down. He thanked her and placed a folded bill on the counter, but she pushed it back toward him without saying a word. He had almost reached the door when she spoke behind him, her voice as calm as if she were commenting on the weather. "You're the first person who's asked me." Cormac stopped and turned his head. The old woman was folding a scarf, her eyes still lowered to her hands. He waited another moment, but she said nothing more. He nodded and walked out. At the time, he didn't understand what she meant. Nearly 2 hours east by car, in New Buffalo, Sloane woke in a room paneled with pale wood that looked directly out over the lake. The lake was frozen all the way to the horizon, a gray-white plain fractured by long cracks, while the wind drove powdered snow across its surface in thin ribbons like smoke. The room was warm and clean, with fresh flowers in a vase, towels folded into neat squares, even a closet where several outfits in her size had already been hung. Nothing in that room looked like a place where someone was being held against her will, and that was precisely what kept her from sleeping. Near noon, Marsh knocked on the door. He brought coffee and a thick leather-bound folder, set it on the desk by the window, then opened it. 42 documents, he said. Take your time. Don't finish them all in one day. Spread them over the 3 days so it looks natural. After all, we've got the whole holiday. He said it with a smile, poured coffee for her, then left and closed the door behind him. Sloane sat down and began to read. She read slowly, 1 page at a time, and by the 9th page, she understood. It was an elaborate chain of manufactured paperwork, consulting contracts for consulting that had never happened, loans between companies that all led back to the same place. If you bothered to turn to the shareholder lists, property revaluation records where the numbers leapt upward without a single supporting appraisal. All of it was designed to move money from the dark into the light, and all of it flowed into Riverline. That wasn't what sent the chill down her spine. What chilled her was reaching the final page and seeing the space reserved for the seal. A signature could be denied. The signer could claim to have been deceived. A lawyer could step forward and defend it, but a notary seal couldn't be denied. The seal certified that the person who held it had witnessed everything with her own eyes, had verified the identification, had confirmed that the signer was fully aware and acting voluntarily. When everything came apart, they wouldn't follow the signatures, they would follow the seal. And that seal bore the name Sloane Whitaker, her commission number, her expiration date, renewed faithfully by her own hand for 6 straight years because a man had once told her it would be convenient for the office. She sat perfectly still for a long time, both hands resting on the folder. Then she opened her purse, took out the seal, and stamped the first page. After that, she opened her blue-covered notebook, placed it beside the documents, and in the margin, using the shorthand only she could read, she wrote down the date, the name of the man who had brought the folder into the room, and his exact words about the holiday. Then she turned to the second page. For 3 days, not a single person who entered that room bothered to glance at the open notebook lying beside her. The name Mercy Northside appeared in the personnel file Fitz's people had obtained, under the emergency contact section, and the next morning Cormac drove there alone. The pediatric ward was on the 4th floor, at the end of a pale yellow hallway lined along the baseboards with paper fish. He didn't go in. He stood by the glass doorway separating the corridor from the common room, both hands in his coat pockets, and looked inside. The entire room was covered with dinosaurs, brightly colored ones cut from magazines, others drawn in crayon, layered over one another until they covered an entire wall. In the middle of the room stood a low table, and on it, a deck of cards was being dealt by a boy of about 8, with curly brown hair, wearing a shirt with a green dinosaur printed on the front. 2 nurses crouched on either side of the table, listening carefully as the boy explained the rules. He said the cards had to be dealt counterclockwise, 1 card at a time, never 2 at once, and anyone who dealt 2 cards together was cheating. One of the nurses argued with him, and the boy burst out laughing, a laugh far too big for his small body, carrying all the way out to where Cormac stood in the hallway. Then the boy said his sister would come on Thursday. She came every Thursday, and this time she had promised to bring cinnamon rolls from Vale's bakery, the kind with sugar sprinkled on top. She bought them on 33rd Street. And they were the best in the whole city, he told the nurses. Cormac stood perfectly still. The hand resting lightly against the door frame had tightened without him realizing it, his knuckles whitening against the cold metal. The bakery on 33rd Street belonged to his mother. At noon, he drove there. The shop was small, with 3 tables set beside the window, and the smell of butter and cinnamon hung so thick in the air that a person had to breathe it in twice before getting used to it. Eileen Vale was kneading dough at the table in back, both bare arms dusted with flour to the elbows, her silver hair pinned up high. She didn't stop when he walked in, and she didn't stop when he pulled out a chair, sat down, and began to talk. He kept it brief, without names, without details, the way he had told his mother things for years, giving her just enough to know that something had happened, and just enough not to know exactly what it was. He told her about a dinner, about someone nobody was looking for, about a workplace that had posted an advertisement for her replacement the very next morning. Eileen listened to all of it, pressing the heel of her palm into the dough, folding it over, pressing again. Then she said, without lifting her eyes from her hands, that all these years he'd been building walls around himself so high no one could reach him anymore, and she knew because she'd watched him lay every brick. She folded the dough once more, and yet someone still managed to reach you. She looked up at her son for the first time since he had walked in. What are you going to do about that? At the same time, in New Buffalo, Sloane asked for a telephone so she could call the hospital, and they transferred the call into the common room. Toby picked up, his voice bright with excitement, and before he even said hello, he was already telling her that he'd won 3 games in a row, that a nurse named Rosa had dealt the cards wrong, that the new dinosaur picture taped to the right corner of the wall was a herbivore, not a carnivore. Did she remember? Then he asked if she was bringing the pastries tomorrow. Sloane said of course she was. She'd already bought them, the ones with sugar on top, and she was saving 2 just for him. She asked whether he'd eaten, reminded him to go to bed on time, laughed when he told his stories, and made a few more promises. Her voice remained completely normal throughout the call, light, steady, perfectly measured, without a single break. Even after the other end went silent, she kept the receiver pressed to her ear for a little while longer. Then she put it down, leaned her back against the edge of the table, and slowly lowered herself onto the wooden floor, wrapping both arms around her knees. Beyond the window, the frozen lake stretched white into the distance, all the way to where the sky and water seemed to disappear into one another. She sat like that until the telephone on the table rang again. The voice on the other end belonged to a middle-aged woman, warm and unhurried, the kind of voice accustomed to speaking with strangers while still making them feel at ease. She introduced herself as Delphine Marsh, head of operations for the foundation, and she asked about Toby using the boy's actual name, asked how his schedule was going, asked whether he'd been behaving himself. Then she said, "You just focus on your work, sweetheart. I'll take care of the rest." Fitz's people traced the license plate the old coat check attendant had read out to him, and by that afternoon they knew the convoy would be leaving New Buffalo and heading back to the city along the lakefront road. Cormac didn't wait. He told Fitz to drive, and they headed straight into the storm. That afternoon, the road along the lake had almost ceased to look like a road at all, nothing more than a dim gray strip between 2 high banks of snow, while the crosswind drove powdered ice in shimmering sheets across the pavement, and the streetlights on either side appeared and vanished like figures standing there waiting. Fitz drove slowly, both hands locked around the steering wheel, and didn't say a word for more than an hour. They caught up with the convoy near the curve by the overpass, 3 vehicles traveling at evenly spaced intervals. The first one pulled ahead. Fitz managed to force the second onto the shoulder, its rear wheels sliding over the ice before the vehicle came to a stop in the snowbank beside the road. Cormac was out of his car before the wheels had fully stopped turning. He yanked open the rear door. There was no one inside except a man in a suit sitting in the middle of the back seat, both hands resting on his thighs, his face as calm as though he were waiting at a red light. On the seat beside him lay a thin gray sweater with a round neckline, slightly worn at the elbows, folded into a neat square and placed carefully as though it were something on display. The man said nothing. He simply raised the phone in his hand, its screen still lit, and switched on the speaker. Gideon Marsh's voice came through above the sound of the wind, clear, measured, without the slightest trace of confusion, as though he were sitting in a warm room far away and had been waiting there for this call for a very long time. He said, "Mr. Vale, You're ruining a $400 million project over a secretary. I genuinely want to hear why. Cormac didn't answer. Because at that exact moment, the third vehicle in the convoy glided past in the opposite lane, slowing slightly as it passed the scene, just enough for him to see through the side window. Sloane was sitting in the back seat beside the door. A thin layer of snow clung to the glass, and the inside of the car was dark, but he recognized her immediately. She had seen him too. They looked at each other through 2 layers of glass, in the middle of the storm, for exactly 2 breaths. She didn't pound on the door. She didn't scream. She didn't open her mouth to call out. She simply raised one hand and pressed her palm against the window, all 5 fingers spread apart, holding it there. Then the car gathered speed again and slipped into the white curtain of snow, and that hand slowly blurred before disappearing completely. Cormac remained standing in the middle of the road, snow collecting on the shoulders of his coat, while the voice from the phone speaker behind him asked once more whether he was listening. He didn't answer. He closed the car door and walked back toward Fitz. At noon the next day, one of Marsh's assistants called to arrange a meeting, and Marsh invited him to lunch at a private club in the old district, a place with dark wood-paneled walls, a real fireplace, and servers who moved through the room without making a sound. He didn't mention what had happened on the lakefront road. He talked about Riverline, about the schedule, about several zoning problems he promised he could clear within a month. Only after the plates had been taken away did he slide a thin stack of papers across the table. Another 12% equity, he said. Transferred directly. No intermediary. Signed today and it becomes effective from the beginning of the quarter. He added that anyone who had been in business long enough eventually stepped into someone else's affairs by mistake. And what made a decent man wasn't whether he ever stepped into the wrong place, but whether he knew when to step back. He said it gently, almost kindly. Then he placed a fountain pen with a gold cap on top of the papers, turned the nib toward Cormac, and leaned back in his chair. Cormac looked at the documents for a very long time. The fire crackled behind Marsh. Outside the window, snow was still falling over the low rooftops of the old district. He picked up the pen, removed the cap, and signed his name on the final line. Fitz waited until the car had left the old district and merged onto the avenue before he spoke. And when he did, his voice trembled with anger, not fear. He said Cormac had just sold that girl. He said he'd followed Cormac for 10 years, had done things he had never told anyone about, and had never once felt ashamed of any of it until today. He went on, saying she had pressed her hand against the car window, while Cormac had sat down to lunch with the man who was taking her away. Cormac let Fitz finish. Then he looked out the window at the low rooftops drifting past beneath the fresh snow, and answered in the same low, even voice, without rising or falling. Now I'm a shareholder. Shareholders have the right to see the books. Fitz fell silent. He glanced into the rearview mirror and caught his boss's eyes there. And that look made him understand that throughout the lunch they had just left, the man sitting on the other side of the table had been the one being led, not the man on this side. Cormac had no intention of confronting Gideon Marsh. Confrontation was for people without money. He had simply bought himself a door, and that door opened inward. From that afternoon on, everything began to happen very slowly and very quietly. No one was threatened. Not a single phone call carried a threatening voice. On the first day, the bank where Holloway and Stroud maintained its revolving line of credit sent a letter announcing a review of the firm's credit file, along with a request for additional documentation within 7 business days. On the third day, the credit line was reduced to 0. On the fourth day, a logistics corporation that was the firm's largest client sent notice terminating its annual consulting agreement, citing a conflict of interest clause, and that corporation had just been very politely reminded by a new shareholder that it might want to read its partner list more carefully. On the fifth day, the second largest client did the same thing without needing to be reminded, because in that world, people watched one another and knew when to run. On the sixth day, the State Bar Association received an anonymous complaint alleging that an attorney had required an administrative employee to maintain her notary commission and then used that commission in transactions whose true nature had never been disclosed to her. Attached was a thick file with dates, copies, and even receipts showing 6 years of commission renewals. Anonymous complaints were usually set aside. Anonymous complaints supported by records that complete were not. By the 7th day, Preston Holloway had already borrowed money from his brother-in-law. Cormac arranged to meet him at a small coffee shop on Wabash, the kind of place with plastic tables and old men who sat reading newspapers all morning. He arrived first, ordered black coffee, and took a seat with his back against the wall. Holloway came in 15 minutes late, his beard poorly shaved, the collar of his shirt wrinkled, and sat down with the look of a man who had rehearsed 3 opening lines in the car and forgotten every one of them the moment he took his seat. Cormac didn't say hello. He placed 2 things on the table. The first was a check already filled out for an amount large enough to pay off the bank debt and preserve the house in Oak Park, where Holloway's wife had lived for 20 years. The second was a typed statement, 4 pages long, detailing everything he knew about the 42 documents, who had ordered them, and why that particular assistant had been chosen instead of someone else. Holloway read the statement. His hands began to shake on the second page. He looked up as though he were about to say something, some explanation, some excuse, and Cormac cut him off with a single sentence, spoken no louder than the sound of coffee being poured into a cup at the counter nearby. Sign, and you keep the house. Don't sign, and I'll buy the house too. There was no threat attached to it, not even a frown. Holloway sat still for about a minute, looking at the check, then at the statement, before pulling a pen from his shirt pocket and signing all 4 pages. He pushed the papers back toward Cormac and reached for the check. Cormac held it in place with 2 fingers. Then he drew it back toward himself, picked it up, and tore it in half directly in front of him. Then he tore it into quarters. He placed the pieces neatly on the saucer beside his cup, the way someone might tap ash from a cigarette. I changed my mind, he said. You don't deserve to be paid. Holloway sat there with his mouth slightly open, unable to make a sound. Cormac picked up the statement, folded it in half, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, stood, and left exactly enough money on the table for 2 cups of coffee. Only when he reached the door did he add one final sentence, without turning around. You still get to keep the house. I don't need it. I just need you to understand that from now on, you don't have anything left to trade. Cormac read Holloway's statement in the car beneath the overhead light, then read it a second time when he got home. There was one passage that made him stop for a long while. On the 3rd page, when Holloway described the way Marsh chose people, he had written that Mr. Marsh always wanted dinner held at the Vantage, always wanted table 12 because it faced away from the dining room and looked directly toward the glass wall, and always wanted someone there to take the minutes. Someone new, never the same person twice. The word that made Cormac fold the paper was always. Not this time. Not that time. Always. The next morning, he returned to the 41st floor before opening hours, while the staff were still vacuuming the carpet and arranging glasses on the shelves. Bertie Kowalski was already behind the coat check counter, wiping down the wooden frame with a soft cloth. She looked at him without the slightest surprise, as though she had been expecting him to come back ever since that day. Cormac asked what she had meant the last time, when she said he was the first person who had ever asked her. Bertie set the cloth down. She looked at him for a moment, long enough to weigh her answer, then bent down and opened a drawer beneath the counter, behind a stack of coat check tickets. She took out a small notebook with a faded blue cloth cover, all 4 corners worn smooth, its spine reinforced with tape, swollen thick from scraps of paper tucked between the pages. She placed it on the counter and pushed it toward him. Cormac opened it. Inside were small handwritten entries, neat and steady, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who had gone to school back when children were still taught to write with fountain pens. One entry to a line, date, table number, name on the reservation, who arrived first, who came later, the time the car entered the garage, and the time it left. And in the final column, the name of the girl who went with them, copied from the employee badge she was still wearing on her chest when she stepped out of the elevator. He flipped backward through the pages. The last page carried the name, Sloane Whitaker. He turned back farther. Before her was another name, nearly a year earlier. Before that, another. Then, another. Then one more. 4 women, 4 winters, the same restaurant, the same table number. I wrote it all down, Bertie said. For years. No one ever asked me. Cormac looked up. The old woman was folding the cleaning cloth again, first into quarters, then into eighths, without looking at him. She said she had stood behind that counter since the restaurant was still on the lower floor, had seen 3 different owners come and go, and through all those years she had learned one thing, that no one ever saw her. People handed her their coats while their eyes stayed on their phones. People took their coats back without saying thank you. People stood directly in front of her and discussed business, discussed money, argued, cried, made plans, as though the place where she stood were empty space. "Because no one sees me," she said. "I see everything." Then she added that once, years ago, she had told a manager what she had noticed, and the manager advised her to keep her mouth shut if she wanted to keep her job, because she was already past 60, and no one hired women again at that age. After that, she never told anyone else. She only wrote things down. Cormac said nothing for a long time. He stood there with the notebook open in his hands, and inside his mind, the picture he had carried with him for the past 2 weeks broke apart and rebuilt itself into something entirely different. He had thought this was about one wealthy man and one secretary. It wasn't. It was a process, something that had been running smoothly for years, with a fixed location, a fixed table number, a method for choosing people, a method for ending things, and every winter a new name appeared in the final column. He looked around the narrow space behind the counter, where a wooden stool stood against the wall. The kind of stool the old woman probably only dared to sit on when there were no customers. He reached over, pulled it out, set it beside her, and sat down. Bertie faltered for a moment. She looked at him sitting there, a man in a black wool coat on a low wooden stool inside the cramped little corner of the coat check attendant, his eyes level with hers. Then she pulled the notebook back toward herself, turned to the very first page, and began reading every line aloud to him. The 3 days in New Buffalo passed, and no one mentioned going home. On the evening of the 4th day, when the housekeeper accidentally left a spare set of keys on the cart outside in the hallway, Sloane took them before she had time to think. She waited until the television downstairs had gone completely silent, pulled on the thin gray sweater, slipped her feet into the shoes that were half a size too big, and went down by the service stairs. The side door opened onto a backyard buried in snow that no one had cleared, and beyond that yard lay the road along the lake. She stepped outside, and the cold seized her instantly. Not the cold of an ordinary morning commute, but a cold with teeth, slipping through every stitch of wool, and finding its way all the way to her breastbone. The lake to her left stretched beneath the dim moon in shades of gray and white. The ice split by long fractures running toward the place where sky and water disappeared into each other, and the wind blowing off that frozen surface struck her directly in the back, carrying powdered snow that stung the skin at the nape of her neck. She walked. There was no sidewalk, only a narrow strip of shoulder between the pavement and a bank of snow rising to her knees. The oversized shoes kept slipping off her heels, forcing her to walk on the balls of her feet, the same pain she had endured throughout that dinner, except now she had to walk that way through snow. After about half a kilometer, she could no longer feel her fingers. After about 1 kilometer, both calves began trembling in waves she could no longer control. She kept walking. She thought about the pale yellow corridor with paper fish taped along the base of the wall. She thought about the 2 cinnamon rolls she had promised. She counted her steps so she wouldn't have to think about anything else. Near the 2-kilometer mark, when the road began curving along the edge of the lake, she saw 2 points of light appear in the distance, trembling through the snow blowing sideways across the road. Sloane stepped all the way into the middle of the roadway, raised both hands, and stood there. The car began slowing from far away, without braking sharply, without sounding its horn. It stopped about 10 paces from her. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was Royce Nadeau. She stood perfectly still. Her hands were still raised, and she couldn't lower them, not because she was afraid, but because the muscles had gone rigid. Nadeau walked slowly around the front of the car, both hands visible, holding nothing. He didn't shout. He didn't grab her arm, didn't pull her, didn't push her. He stopped in front of her, looked down at her shoes, then removed the black wool coat he was wearing and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was heavy and still warm from his body. "You made it farther than I thought you would," he said. Then he opened the rear door, stepped back, and waited until she climbed inside on her own. The heater was running, and for the roughly 15-minute drive back, neither of them said anything. Nadeau drove steadily, eyes fixed ahead, both hands positioned properly on the steering wheel. When they were nearly back at the gate of the house, he said only one more sentence, without turning around, without looking into the rearview mirror. "I have a daughter too." Then he pulled the car up beside the front steps. Marsh was waiting in the living room, wearing a turtleneck sweater and holding a cup of tea, and when she walked in, he didn't appear angry in the slightest. He told someone in the house to bring her a blanket and a cup of warm water. He asked whether her feet were all right, told her to soak them in warm water and not hold them near the fire, because heat like that would damage them. He waited until she had sat down, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and curled both hands around the cup. Then he pulled a chair over and sat across from her, placed a tablet on the table between them, and turned the screen toward her. On the screen was a Mercy Northside Hospital chart, the waiting list for the pediatric cardiology surgical program arranged in columns. The first column held the patient identification number. The second held the name. On the 11th line from the top was Toby Whitaker. The final column showed priority status, and the box on his row was blank, a plain white rectangle with a cursor blinking inside it. Marsh didn't point at the screen. He didn't say a single word about the boy. He simply left the screen there, glowing between them, then said in the same considerate voice he always used that from now on he wouldn't lock her bedroom door anymore, that she could leave whenever she wanted, that he never kept anyone against their will. Then he finished the last sip of his tea, stood, and before going upstairs added that as for that empty box, he would fill it in tomorrow morning. The next morning, Sloane woke, and the first thing she did was walk to the bedroom door and place her hand on the knob. It turned. She pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty, covered in thick beige carpeting, with no one standing there, no one sitting at the top of the stairs, no sound of footsteps from the floor below. Morning light from the window at the far end of the corridor fell across the carpet in a long strip, and beyond that window lay the lake, white from end to end, and the road where she had walked nearly 2 kilometers the night before. The door was open. No one was keeping her there. All she had to do was step out, walk to the end of the hallway, go down the stairs, leave through the side door, and keep going. Sloane stood there for a very long time, one hand still resting on the doorknob, her bare feet on the cold wooden floor. She stood there until the strip of sunlight on the carpet had shifted noticeably. Then she pulled the door closed, gently, and heard the latch settle into place, a sound so small it was almost nothing. She had closed it herself. No one had closed it for her. She returned to the desk by the window, sat down, opened the file, and continued from the page where she had stopped the night before. Near noon, when she reached the third stack of papers inside the leather folder, she came across a set of documents unlike the others. It wasn't a consulting contract. It wasn't a valuation report. It was a reconciliation file between the Foundation's funding and Mercy Northside Hospital, probably tucked in there because someone had gathered every document requiring notarization that month into the same place. Sloane was about to turn past it. Then she saw the name of the pediatric cardiology program printed across the top of the page, and her hand stopped. She read from the beginning. It was a funding reconciliation statement, listing each amount, each recorded date, each subfund identification number. At the very end was an approval page, and on that page, in the line reserved for the person authorized to approve disbursements, Gideon Marsh's name wasn't there. There was a handwritten signature, slightly slanted, firm and certain, and beneath it was the typed name of a woman Sloane had never heard of in her life. Eileen Vale. She turned back through the pages, traced the subfund number upward through the records, and spent nearly an hour piecing together the entire story from the dry numbers on the paper. Mercy Northside's pediatric cardiology program wasn't being sustained by Gideon Marsh's money. It was being sustained by a subfund established years earlier, whose original capital had come from the entire life insurance payout of a 19-year-old girl. The beneficiary had refused to keep the money and transferred all of it to the hospital, asking to remain anonymous, retaining only one right, the authority to approve every case funded from that account. The name Eileen Vale appeared there, on the approval line, and nowhere else in the entire file. It wasn't on the Board of Trustees list, wasn't on the donor wall, wasn't on a single Marsh Foundation brochure. The Marsh Foundation's name, meanwhile, was everywhere. On the sign in the lobby, on the walls beneath framed photographs, in every newspaper article. And Gideon Marsh, with his seat on the hospital's Board of Trustees, controlled exactly one thing. Not the money, not the authority to decide who received surgery, but the power to arrange the order of the waiting list. The empty box in the final column he had made sure she saw the night before. The money had already been there. The money belonged to someone who was dead. He had never contributed a single dollar. He had simply taken the gift someone else had left behind, wrapped it in glossy paper, and sold it to her as though it were his own kindness. Sloane sat perfectly still with the paper in her hands. Outside the window, the wind was driving powdered snow across the surface of the lake again in thin ribbons. She thought about that morning in Halloway's office, when he had mentioned the Marsh Foundation, in the light voice of someone talking about the weather. She thought about the hand tapping twice against the back of hers. "You see, I always take care of my people. She sat that way for a long time, without crying, without moving, only her shoulders slowly lowering. Then she placed the paper back exactly where it had been in the file, pulled the blue-covered notebook toward her, opened to a fresh page, and began to write. She wrote down the sub-fund number. She wrote the date each amount had been recorded. She wrote the name on the approval line, spelling it letter by letter so she wouldn't make a mistake. Then she turned to the next page in the file, took out her seal, and stamped it. After that morning in the coffee shop on Wabash, Preston Halloway no longer dared keep anything in his office. He had 42 sets of original documents bearing the notary seal and a hard drive containing every scanned copy. And he knew that as long as all of it remained inside the safe on the 22nd floor, he wouldn't sleep peacefully. He needed somewhere to store it, somewhere discreet, somewhere cheap, and above all, somewhere no one would think to look. Right around then, a small logistics company called and offered him a row of containers at the southern harbor at an unusually low rental price on a 3-month contract, paid in one lump sum, with no requirement to declare what kind of goods would be stored. He asked why it was so cheap, and the voice on the other end said business was slow this season. There was plenty of empty storage space, and any rental was better than none. Halloway signed that very afternoon. He didn't know who owned the logistics company. He also didn't know that the company had received a suggestion from another company, which in turn had received a suggestion from another one, and that if anyone had taken the trouble to trace the chain backward through all 3 layers, it would have led to a desk in Bridgeport, where more than a week earlier someone had given a simple instruction. Make the price cheap. Cheap enough that no one has time to ask another question. The night the files were moved came near the end of the season, with wet, heavy snow falling, the kind that clung to a man's shoulders before melting into cold water. Halloway's small convoy of trucks passed through the gate, while the container yard was still operating at full capacity. High floodlight washing the entire area in white, cranes shrieking steadily overhead, reversing alarms sounding, steel striking steel, and echoing far across the river. They reached Row K, opened the container, and began unloading boxes of files. Cormac stood on the steel walkway of the operations building about 200 meters away, both hands in his coat pockets, looking down. Fitz stood beside him holding a radio. He told him how much money they would lose if the entire harbor shut down for one night, including the contractual penalties owed to 3 shipping companies waiting to have their cargo cleared. Cormac didn't ask him to repeat the number. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't negotiate. He answered with one word: stop. Fitz looked at his boss for another second, then raised the radio to his mouth, and the entire southern harbor went dark. Not all at once. It shut down row by row. Row A first, then row B, then row C, walls of white light collapsing one after another like someone closing the pages of a very large book. The crane stopped in mid-motion, one steel arm left hanging with a container suspended roughly 3 stories above the ground, frozen there in the air. Engines went silent. Reversing alarms went silent. In less than 2 minutes, the loudest place in the city fell into a silence so thick that people could hear snow landing on the corrugated metal roofs. Then the main gate closed, then the side gate, then the eastern truck gate, and the dock workers began stepping out from the passageways between the rows of containers. They came slowly, no one calling to anyone else, no one asking why, because they had worked at that harbor long enough to understand that when the lights went out like this, it meant there was an order. They formed 2 lines along both sides of the main lane, nearly 200 men in faded orange reflective jackets, wool caps pulled low, arms folded across their chests, snow gradually collecting on their shoulders. Not one of them said a word. In the middle of that corridor of people, beneath the only light that remained, a handful of dull yellow emergency lamps, Halloway's little convoy sat stranded beside the container in Row K, the rear doors of the trucks still hanging wide open, and several half-unloaded boxes of files resting on the wet concrete. His men stopped working, turned their heads, looked around, and began to understand what was happening. Halloway climbed out of the vehicle and stood in the middle of the lane, staring at the 2 silent rows of men staring back at him. Then the harbor loudspeaker system came alive with a brief burst of static, and Cormac Vale's voice carried across the entire container yard. Not loud, not harsh, steady as a man reading an inventory. You entered my harbor. You leave when my foot says you can. The words struck the steel walls around them, echoed once, then disappeared into the falling snow. Halloway stood there beneath nearly 200 pairs of eyes, in the middle of a harbor whose lights had been shut down because of him, And in that moment he understood that the suspiciously cheap storage rate had never been a bargain. While Holloway stood rooted in the middle of the main lane, one man broke away from the convoy and headed back toward the dark rows of containers. Cormac recognized the way he moved even from the steel walkway above, the gait of someone accustomed to walking without making a sound, his shoulders never rising or falling. Cormac went down the stairs. Fitz started to follow, but Cormac raised a hand and signaled for him to stay. Between the steel containers stacked 3 levels high, the dull yellow emergency lights reached only as high as a man's knees, while everything above disappeared completely into darkness, and the intersecting lanes formed a maze only the people who worked there knew by heart. Cormac knew it. He didn't run after him. He cut across row J, circled ahead, and waited in the open space between 2 rows. Royce Nadeau appeared at the end of the lane and stopped short when he saw him. The 2 men looked at each other for a moment. Then Nadeau backed into the nearest open container, and Cormac followed him inside. The wind slammed the steel door shut behind them, and the entire container went black, without a trace of light. There was the sound of footsteps turning on the metal floor. There was breathing. Then came a hard impact against the steel wall that sent a deep, long vibration through the entire container. After that came the ragged breathing of 2 men, then the rustle of clothing sliding against the floor. When everything finally went still, Cormac had Nadeau's shoulder pinned down, one knee braced across him, while Nadeau lay motionless beneath him, no longer struggling, only breathing. Cormac held him there for a few more seconds. Then he let go. He stood, stepped back, pulled his phone from his pocket, turned on the screen, and placed it face down on the floor so the light reflected upward and cast a dim circle across the ceiling. Nadeau pushed himself upright and leaned back against the wall without saying anything. Cormac sat on a wooden crate across from him. From the inside pocket of his coat, he took out a thin file folded in half, opened it flat, and placed it on the steel floor between them. "Your daughter is in her 2nd year at Champaign," he said. "Nursing. This semester is fully paid. Her tuition comes from Marsh's foundation, routed through a scholarship program carrying his name, and every semester someone reminds you exactly who's paying for it." Nadeau surged up from the wall, and Cormac didn't move. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not finished." Nadeau stood there, both fists clenched, breathing through his nose. Then he actually sat back down. Cormac used the toe of his shoe to slide the file across the steel floor toward him. "Starting next semester, I pay," he said. "All of it, until she graduates. There's already an escrow account at the bank. There's already a guarantor on record, and all the paperwork is in there. You only have to sign your name on the last page. No conditions." Nadeau looked down at the papers, but didn't reach for them. In the hoarse voice of a man still trying to catch his breath, he said he had been doing this long enough to know there was no such thing in the world as no conditions. Cormac nodded slowly. He told him to read it, and he would see for himself. Sign or don't sign, the money would still be transferred at the beginning of the semester. He didn't have to tell Cormac anything. He could walk out of that container, get in his car, and drive away, and Cormac wouldn't stop him. The girl would still stay in school. Then he fell silent. Inside the steel container, there was nothing left but the wind whistling through the gaps in the door and the sound of wet snow striking the roof. Nadeau sat there for a long time, long enough for both of his hands to slowly unclench and come to rest on his knees. Finally, he asked why. Cormac looked at the faint circle of light on the container ceiling. He said he knew exactly what to do with a man who had a child. He knew how many pieces of paper it took, how many phone calls had to be made, how long it took before that man broke. He had known that for a very long time, and he had never used it. "There are some things I don't touch," he said. "Not because I'm a good man, but because if I touch them, then what makes me any different from Marsh?" Nadeau lowered his head. He stayed that way for a while longer. Then he reached out, pulled the file toward himself, folded it, slipped it inside his coat, and began to talk. He said the hard drive wasn't in any of the boxes outside. It was inside Holloway's leather briefcase, the one he never let out of his hands, and tonight he had brought it with him. Then he paused, looked up at Cormac through the dim light, and added something no one had forced him to say. "As for the girl, she's in the 2nd room on the left wing, top floor, overlooking the lake. If you leave now, you'll get there before sunrise." Nadeau didn't drive straight away as he had been allowed to. He left the harbor, headed back along the lake road through the night, and reached New Buffalo while the sky was still completely dark. He didn't knock on her door. He stood in the hallway and called through it with exactly one sentence. telling her she had 10 minutes, then went downstairs to wait. Sloane put on the gray sweater, slipped into the shoes that were half a size too big, picked up the blue-covered notebook, and followed him. For nearly 2 hours on the road, neither of them said a word. When the car pulled over near the side entrance of the southern harbor, dawn still hadn't come, and the entire port remained swallowed in the strange darkness of a place that ordinarily never turned its lights off. Sloane stepped out, passed through the gate that had been left partly open, and the first thing she saw was 2 rows of men in faded orange reflective jackets, standing silently in the snow along the main lane, their shoulders covered in white. No one stopped her. They simply moved aside, and at the far end of that corridor of people, Preston Halloway was running. He clutched the leather briefcase against his chest, ran around the back of one of the trucks, and headed toward the base of crane number 4, where a spiral steel staircase climbed straight up to the operator's cabin, about 5 stories above the ground. He began climbing. Sloane understood immediately what he meant to do. From that crane cabin, the view below opened onto the black surface of the river, still not completely frozen, and if a small plastic box fell into that water, no one would ever recover it. Not ever. She ran to the base of the crane and started climbing after him. Every steel step was covered with wet snow that had already begun freezing into a thin crust. The handrails were so cold that gripping them sent pain shooting all the way to her elbows, and the wind higher up was many times stronger than it had been below, blowing sideways and striking her back in violent bursts. She climbed with both hands, her oversized shoes slipping on the steps, the notebook wedged tightly under one arm because she didn't dare let it go. By the time she reached the final step, Halloway was already on the platform, struggling to open the briefcase with fingers numbed by the cold. He turned and saw her. For one very brief moment, something close to fear crossed his face. Not fear of her, but fear of the thing he himself was about to do. Then he managed to pull the hard drive from the briefcase and reached his hand out beyond the railing. Sloane lunged forward and caught his wrist. Both of them grabbed the small plastic box, she on one side, he on the other, holding it beyond the edge of the railing, with the Black River 5 stories below them. Neither of them struck the other. Neither of them yanked. There were only 4 hands locked around something smaller than a school notebook, while the wind drove snow into both their faces. He told her to let go. He said she didn't understand anything, said he was only an employee too, said that if this fell into the river then everything would finally be quiet. Sloane didn't let go. She stood there with both hands pale from the cold, her hair plastered against her cheeks, and spoke to him in an ordinary voice, the same voice she used when reading meeting minutes back in conference rooms. She asked him whether he knew why he had chosen her. Halloway didn't answer. She said, "Because you thought I had nothing to lose. Because you looked at me for 6 years and saw someone without a home, without anyone behind her, someone wearing borrowed shoes, and you thought no one would ever believe a person like that no matter what she said." Then she said the final words very slowly. "You were wrong. I have more than you do." Halloway's hands went still. He looked at her, and over the space of 2 breaths, something inside him collapsed, something that had kept him standing straight for all those years on the 22nd floor. He thought about the house in Oak Park that he had still been allowed to keep. He thought about the check torn into 4 pieces and left on the saucer beside the coffee cup. He thought about how, from now on, he had nothing left to offer in exchange for anything. Then his fingers slowly opened. Sloane pulled the hard drive toward herself, pressed it tightly against her chest with both hands, stepped back, and leaned against the wall of the crane cabin. Halloway remained there with both empty hands still extended toward the railing, then lowered them and sank down onto the steel floor. Below, in the dull yellow pool of light between 2 rows of containers, Cormac Vale stood with his face tilted upward. He had reached the base of the crane when she was only halfway up. He didn't climb after her. He simply stood there with both hands in his pockets and watched her carry it down herself, 1 step at a time. The house in Beverly stood at the end of a quiet street lined with old oak trees, a 2-story red brick home with a steep roof and a white-painted wooden porch, so much like every other house on the block that a person's eyes could pass over it without stopping. Inside, it was warm and clean, with an electric fireplace, a kitchen stocked with dry goods, and not a single photograph on the walls. Fitz brought out a laptop and set it on the dining table, plugged in the hard drive, and all 3 of them stood around the glowing screen in a room where not all the lights had been turned on yet. The computer recognized the device. Fitz opened the main folder, Empty. He tried again, unplugged it, connected it once more, ran data recovery software, and spent about 15 minutes typing with both hands still numb from the cold, still empty. Nothing had been deleted. There had never been anything on it at all. Holloway had switched it beforehand, probably the very day he signed the storage contract, and the thing he had guarded so fiercely in his briefcase for all those days, the thing he had nearly thrown into the river, was nothing more than an empty plastic shell used as bait. Fitz shot to his feet so suddenly that the chair toppled over, then drove his fist into the wall once, and stood there with his forehead pressed against the wallpaper, breathing. Cormac said nothing. He stood beside the dining table with both hands in the pockets of the coat he still hadn't taken off, his eyes fixed on the empty screen, and remained that way for a very long time. He thought about the 200 men who had stood silently in the snow the night before. He thought about the floodlights going dark row by row. He thought about the additional 12% equity he had signed for, just to buy himself a seat inside that room, all of it to bring back a box with nothing inside. Sloane sat at the far end of the table, still wrapped in a blanket, both feet soaking in a basin of warm water Fitz had brought out for her when they first arrived. She heard everything, saw everything, and didn't look alarmed in the slightest. She pulled the purse from beneath her chair into her lap, opened it, and took out a blue cloth-covered notebook, its edges curled, its pages thickened from being turned so many times. She placed it on the wooden table and pushed it toward the center. "It's all right," she said. "I copied everything down." Fitz turned around. Cormac looked down at the notebook. Sloane opened it and slowly flipped back to the first page so they could see. From top to bottom, the pages were packed with a kind of writing neither man in the room could read. Broken strokes, small circles, short hooks arranged in perfectly even rows, with columns of ordinary numerals scattered among them. She explained that it was shorthand, something she had learned in her first year and kept using for 6 years because her job was to record other people's words fast enough to keep pace with the way they spoke. Then she began to read. She read the identification number of the first document, the date it had been notarized, the time of day, the name of the person who had brought the file into the room, and the exact words that person had spoken when setting the leather case on the desk. Then the second document, then the third. She read through more than a dozen entries without stumbling, without having to search for her place, and every entry contained some detail no one could have invented. An offhand remark, a complaint about the weather, an abbreviated name. All 42 documents were there. Along with them, on the final pages, were the hospital subfund identification number, the date each amount had been recorded, and one name she had written out letter by letter. Fitz dropped heavily back into his chair. Cormac remained standing, and for a long while he said nothing, only looked at the open notebook beneath the light. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. That night, Sloane was taken to a bedroom upstairs. When she opened the closet to find something dry to change into, she found an entire row of women's clothing hanging inside, in every size from the smallest to the largest. Sweaters, coats, pants, with shoes arranged in neat rows beneath them, everything still carrying its paper tags. She stood looking at it for a while, then turned toward the staircase, where Cormac was standing at the bottom step. "Do you keep a lot of women here?" she asked. Cormac looked up. "I keep a lot of people who need to disappear," he said. Then he pointed toward the closet. "Take whatever fits. No one wears shoes half a size too big in this house." Late that night, Sloane couldn't sleep. She went downstairs, sat in the armchair beside the electric fireplace, drew both knees up against her chest, and kept shivering. The cold from the night before seemed to have worked its way inside her and stayed there, refusing to leave. Cormac was still awake. He went into the adjoining room, opened a low cabinet, and when he returned, he was carrying an old moss-green wool scarf, its fibers fuzzy from years of washing, one end slightly faded. Without saying anything, he draped it around her shoulders, then sat down in the chair across from her. Sloane pulled the two ends of the scarf closer together, and her fingers traced the edge near one corner. Then her whole body went still. She drew that corner closer to the light and looked. 3 stitches sat out of line beside one another, the place where the knitter had slipped the needle, picked the stitch back up incorrectly, and simply continued. She knew those 3 stitches. She had knitted them. She turned toward the end of the scarf, and there, about a handspan beyond the place where she had stopped, the yarn changed to a different shade of green, darker than the first, and the newer stitches were uneven, some too tight, some too loose. the work of someone unaccustomed to knitting or someone who hadn't held needles in a very long time. My mother finished it, Cormac said. She said if a scarf isn't finished, the person who made it still has a reason to come back for it. Sloane looked up at him, and he began to tell her. He said his younger sister's name was Maeve. She was 19. She had suffered from a heart condition since childhood, the kind doctors said could still allow her to live a normal life as long as she took her medication regularly, didn't overexert herself, and didn't get too cold. That winter, she was in her first year of college, working evening shifts at a bookstore near Pilsen, and she often took the bus home late at night. On that particular night, she collapsed at a bus stop on Halstead. The shelter had a roof, but 3 sides were open, and the wind blew straight through it. No one else was there. Cormac stopped for a moment. Then he continued, saying that a young woman had happened to walk past. She was about 21, on her way to a night shift, and she had stopped. She called an ambulance. She took off her own scarf and wrapped it around Maeve, then sat beside her, held her head, talked to her, and didn't leave until the ambulance arrived. Then she went away. She didn't leave her name. She didn't leave a phone number. She didn't stay for anyone to thank her. The only thing they were left with was the scarf. Cormac looked down at his hands. He said that night he had been in a meeting on the 30th floor of a building about 4 kilometers away. His phone had been lying face down on the table, set to silent. A message came in near midnight. He read it when dawn was already beginning to break the next morning. He didn't say what the message had said. He only said that after all these years, he had never deleted it, and that for a long time he had searched for the young woman from the bus stop, asking around Pilsen, asking at late-night shops, asking at bus stations, until eventually he stopped. "You didn't save her," he said. "Neither did I. What was wrong with her wasn't something anyone could have saved by then. But you were there. I wasn't." He stood, went into the adjoining room again, and returned with a paper envelope whose edges had yellowed with age. He said his mother had kept it all these years. It was a letter Maeve had written to him but never had the chance to send, found in the drawer of her desk. He handed it to her. Sloane opened it. The letter was short, written in blue ballpoint pen, in the rounded handwriting of a young girl. Maeve wrote about the bookstore, about an older customer who always came in asking for books but never bought one, about how she had finally learned to make coffee without burning it, about how she was thinking of changing her major to art history and was afraid their mother would be angry. Nothing important, just small things. And on the final line, she had written that he shouldn't worry. She knew he was busy. She had only wanted someone to tell. Sloane finished reading and sat still for a long time, the paper open across her lap, her hands resting on either side of it. Because she realized she had written something like that too. Not because she expected to be rescued, only because she needed one person to know. Cormac asked her quietly why she had added the table number. Sloane looked into the fireplace. She said that a cry for help without an address was something no one could ever reach. She said she hadn't written it for him. She hadn't even known who he was. There had been 40 people in that room that night. Servers, bartenders, people eating dinner 3 steps away from her. She had written it for anyone. Then she turned and looked at him. "You were the only one who bothered to look down at the table." The next morning, when Fitz compared Bertie Kowalski's cloth-covered notebook with the names in Halloway's statement, one detail didn't match. In the statement, Halloway said that he had chosen his own assistant. But in 3 of the 4 cases before Sloane, the women had worked for 3 different companies, and none of them had anything to do with Halloway and Stroud. Someone else had been choosing them. Fitz traced the Foundation's internal records and found a list that had been updated regularly every season, titled "Suitable Candidates for the Support Program." The person who compiled the list, approved it, and made the calls herself was the Foundation's executive director, Delphine Marsh, Gideon's former wife. 3 criteria were written clearly at the top of the page, neat and orderly like an ordinary personnel form, in urgent need of money, responsible for a dependent family member, and without anyone close enough to believe them if they ever spoke about what had happened. Sloane went to the Foundation headquarters that afternoon. The conference room was on the 3rd floor, its walls painted cream, and all 4 walls were covered with photographs of children. Large photographs in pale wooden frames, one child holding balloons, another wearing a paper hat, another grinning with missing front teeth, every one of them smiling. Beneath each frame was a small brass plaque, showing the year and the name of the program. Delphine Marsh rose to greet her, wearing an ivory cashmere sweater, her hair neatly styled, and extended both hands to shake hers. She invited Sloane to sit. She asked how Toby had been lately, using that exact first name, in the same warm voice Sloane had heard over the telephone in New Buffalo. Sloane sat down and placed her purse on her lap. She said she had read the list. Mrs. Delphine's expression didn't change. She poured Sloane a glass of water, set it down, then returned to her chair. She didn't deny a single word. She said yes. She had made the list. She had been making it for years, and she made it very carefully. She said she didn't choose people in order to hurt anyone. She said every season the foundation needed more money than it had the year before, needed more hospital beds, more equipment, more programs, and that money came from projects that would cease to exist if anyone examined the paperwork too closely. She said she simply found people who needed something the foundation could give them, and in exchange they helped with something only they could do. She called it a fair exchange between two sides that were both in need. Then she slowly gestured around all four walls, sweeping past every one of those smiling faces, and looked back at Sloane. "Where do you think the money comes from that lets those children smile like that?" she asked. The room remained silent for a long time. Sloane didn't answer the question. She opened her purse, took out the blue cloth-covered notebook, placed it on the polished conference table, and turned to a page already marked with a small slip of paper. She said that afternoon, after speaking with her brother on the telephone, there had been a second call. She read the date. She read the time that afternoon. She read the caller's name, the title the woman had used when introducing herself, and then she read the exact 3 sentences Delphine had spoken, word for word, including the half-beat of hesitation before she said the boy's name. Then Sloane turned to the next page and said there were 4 more names here, the same table number, the same restaurant, the same method of choosing, and an old woman had been recording them for years in a place no one had ever thought to look. Delphine Marsh stared at the notebook on the table. She reached toward it as though to pull it closer, then stopped halfway. She said Sloane couldn't read that writing, meaning no one could. Sloane closed the notebook and picked it up. "I can read it," she said. "For 6 years, I've been the only one who could." Then she stood, and before leaving, she paused beside the nearest photograph, a little girl wearing a blue paper hat. She told the woman still sitting behind her that those children didn't need her to choose anyone. They only needed people to stop using their names as something to bargain with. Royce Nadeau called that evening and arranged to meet in the parking lot of a supermarket that had already closed for the night in Bridgeport. He didn't get out of the car. He lowered the window, handed over a hard drive wrapped in a cloth pouch, and said Marsh kept this one in the private safe at his house, not at the office, and that Nadeau was the only person he trusted to retrieve it whenever he needed it. Then he added that he had signed the paper on the final page, and that he would testify. Fitz brought the hard drive back to Beverly and connected it to the computer. This time the machine recognized it, and the folders appeared packed with files. There was the entire Riverline record. There were the Foundation's books. There were recordings of meetings Marsh had made himself as protection. Fitz opened another folder at the bottom of the list, its name only 3 letters long, and he sat motionless for a while before calling Cormac over. Cormac stepped behind him and leaned down to look at the screen. 10 years were inside. Freight contracts, union records, money moving through 4 shell companies, photographs taken from a distance, lists of meetings with dates, times, names, and locations. There were even things Cormac himself had believed had been resting undisturbed at the bottom of the river for years. Gideon Marsh had been quietly collecting all of it over a decade, not because he planned to use it, but because he wanted it ready, so that one day, if the man at the southern harbor ever became difficult to control, all Marsh would have to do was open the safe and place it on the table. The same method, the same leash. The only difference was that with a secretary, he used an empty box on a screen, and with Cormac Vale, he used 10 years. "Boss, your name is in this," Fitz said. "I know," Cormac replied. "You lose everything." Cormac didn't answer. He straightened, turned the plain steel ring on his finger once, then a second time, then stopped. He told Fitz to make 3 copies and store them separately, then took his coat and walked out the door. For the entire week that followed, he didn't touch the hard drive again. He sat in the Dockworkers Union conference room from morning until night, day after day, with men whose fathers had worked at the Southern Harbor before them. He didn't tell them what was about to happen. He simply put one problem at a time on the table and solved it. He transferred operating control of 3 terminals to a new joint venture in which the union held the controlling interest. He signed long-term leases in advance with 2 shipping companies, locking in rates, locking in volume, even locking in employment provisions so no one could cut workers for 3 years. He forced the bank to preserve the credit line for that joint venture by pledging the last assets still held in his own name as collateral. He did all of it with a cold expression and an even voice, bargaining over every clause, yielding on nothing, exactly the way he had worked for 10 years. By the end of the week, 400 jobs at the Southern Harbor had been secured on paper under a legal entity that carried no connection to the Vail name. On Monday morning, Cormac drove alone to the federal building on Dearborn, carrying the hard drive and 3 copies. He didn't bring a lawyer. He handed over everything, keeping back not a single folder, including the one with the 3-letter name at the bottom of the list. Fitz waited outside in the car for 3 hours, and when Cormac finally walked out, the sun had begun to break through, the pale light of late winter falling across the snow melting along the sidewalk. Fitz didn't ask anything. He only watched his boss open the car door and get in. Then he said quietly that 10 years were finished. Riverline was finished. Cormac gave one small nod. He looked out through the window at people moving normally along the street, carrying coffee, pulling their collars higher against the wind. "I used to have everything," he said, "and my sister still had to walk alone." He said nothing more. Fitz started the engine, and they headed south, passing the harbor, where the cranes had been running again for days, their steel arms turning slowly against the brightening sky, while not one of the 200 people working below knew that the place had just changed hands. The trial opened on an early spring morning, when the snow on the steps of the federal courthouse had melted into dark pools of water. The prosecutor offered to read Sloane's statement on her behalf, the way they often did with a witness appearing in court for the first time. She said no. She said she would read it herself. She stepped up to the witness stand, with the blue cloth-covered notebook in her hands, set it down, opened it to the page she had marked, and before beginning, she lifted her eyes and looked across the entire courtroom once. Then she read the first sentence. "My name is Sloane Whitaker. For 6 years, I have written down other people's words. Today, I am reading my own." The courtroom went completely silent. She read for more than 2 hours, her voice steady, never stumbling, never needing to be prompted. She read the identification number of every document, the date each one had been notarized, the name of the person who had brought the file into the room, the words they had spoken when they set the leather case down on the table. She read the subfund identification number, the date each amount had been recorded, and the name on the approval line that she had written out letter by letter. She read the exact 3 sentences from the telephone call that afternoon. When the defense attorney challenged her by saying no one could verify the shorthand, the court brought in a shorthand expert to compare it, and that person read back every line exactly, without a single error. In the row behind her sat 4 women side by side. They didn't know one another. They came from 4 different companies, from 4 different winters, and before that day, not one of them had ever told anyone about her dinner. At the end of the row sat an elderly woman with short silver hair and thin-framed glasses, both hands wrapped around a cloth-covered notebook, worn smooth at all 4 corners, its spine reinforced with tape. When the court clerk called the name Bertie Kowalski, she stood, straightened the front of her clothing, and walked to the witness stand carrying that notebook in her hands. Gideon Marsh and Delphine Marsh were charged with a series of offenses so extensive that the indictment took nearly 15 minutes to read aloud. Preston Halloway testified before everyone else, told them everything, and accepted his sentence. Royce Nadeau reached an agreement with the prosecution, testified in court, and his sentence was reduced to the lowest level legally possible. His daughter remained in school at Champaign, and that semester's tuition had already been transferred to the university before the trial began. No one was retaliated against. No one disappeared. There were only consequences, arriving slowly, but arriving in full. Around that same time, one night roughly 2 weeks before the trial, Cormac sat in the 4th-floor hallway of Mercy Northside Hospital on a blue plastic chair beside a vending machine. He had no right to go inside. He wasn't family. His name appeared on none of the paperwork, and he knew it. He simply sat there with both elbows resting on his knees, looking down at the tile floor. Eileen Vale sat beside her son, her coat folded across her lap, a little flower still caught beneath her fingernails because she had come straight from the bakery. She didn't ask him why he was there. She only reached over, took his hand, and held it between both of hers. Then she said, "This time, we get to wait." They sat that way until the door at the end of the hallway opened, and a doctor walked toward the sister waiting there and told her everything had gone well, better than expected, and that now all they needed was time. Sloane nodded, thanked him, then had to brace herself against the wall. The next morning, when Toby was fully awake, the first thing he did was open his eyes, look around the room, see his sister sitting beside the bed, and immediately ask whether there were any pastries left. Sloane burst out laughing, and the laugh brought tears to her eyes before she had time to wipe them away. She said, of course there were. He asked if they were the kind with sugar sprinkled on top. She said they were exactly that kind. He said then everything was fine, and closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Out in the hallway, on the plastic chair beside the vending machine, the black wool coat was no longer there. The only thing left on the seat was a small paper bag printed with the name of a bakery on 33rd Street, its top carefully folded closed, and inside were 2 cinnamon rolls, still warm. Cormac Vale's sentence was handed down on an afternoon in April. He received a suspended sentence, along with an order forfeiting every asset connected to the case, and the list was so long that it took the court clerk 4 full minutes to read it aloud. When she finished, the only thing left that wasn't on the list was a small bakery on 33rd Street, owned by Eileen Vale, since before her son had earned his first dollar. Fitz Brannigan drove him back to his mother's house that afternoon, and along the way he finally asked a question he had been holding inside for weeks. He asked why Cormac hadn't gone looking for her. Cormac looked out through the window. I already took 3 days of her life, he said. I'm not taking any more. And after that, he never spoke about it again. Not once. That summer, he learned from his mother how to knead dough all over again, and little by little, people in the neighborhood grew accustomed to the sight of a tall man in a baker's apron standing behind the counter at 5 o'clock in the morning, his shirt sleeves rolled up as he pushed trays of pastries into the oven. Months later, Sloane returned to law school, taking classes at night, and in the afternoons she worked part-time for a free legal advice hotline serving workers who had been mistreated in the workplace, operating out of 2 rented rooms above a laundromat. The hotline took calls from waitresses, hotel housekeepers, coat check attendants, office assistants. On the glass door was a small sign with only 2 words and a number, and no stranger passing outside understood what it meant. Table 12. One Saturday afternoon in early fall, she walked to 33rd Street, pushed open the bakery door, stepped into the thick smell of butter and cinnamon, and waited until the last customers had gone. Then she placed a cardboard coaster on the wooden counter, its edges yellowed with age, one side still bearing the 2 hastily written words in careful handwriting, with the faded circle of a water ring pressed across the middle. Cormac looked at it. Then she turned the coaster over. On the back were only 2 words, written in fresh ink. Stay with me. He didn't say anything. He wiped his hands on his apron, walked around the end of the counter, and came to where she stood. That fall, on an afternoon washed in pale sunlight, the 3 of them went to the shore of Lake Michigan, to a stretch lined with smooth pebbles. Toby taught Cormac how to skip stones across the water, explaining with great seriousness that he had to choose a flat one, throw it low and close to the surface, and snap his wrist at the very last second. And after Cormac failed 3 times in a row, the boy shook his head and told him he was terrible at it, that he needed more practice and Toby would grade him again tomorrow. Cormac said all right, then bent down to pick up another stone. In the boy's dinosaur-covered notebook, the list of things he planned to do after getting well had grown to 15 lines, and the final line had been added in crooked handwriting, with a different colored pen. Teach the man in the black coat how to skip stones. Sloane stood a few steps away, with her hands in her coat pockets, a moss-green wool scarf wrapped around her neck, 3 crooked stitches near one corner, and a section at the end finished in yarn of a different shade. She watched the 2 of them down by the stones and said nothing. There are people who pass through our lives every day without us ever taking the time to truly see them. The person pouring water at the dinner table, the person hanging coats by the restaurant door, the person sitting quietly behind powerful men and writing down their words. Every one of those people has a name. Every one of them has a story. And not one of them was born to become something that could be traded for something else, no matter how precious that other thing might be. A person's dignity is not a price to be paid, and power becomes truly worthwhile only on the day it is used to give someone back their own voice. Sometimes kindness isn't found in being able to save someone. Sometimes it is simply in being willing to look down and notice, willing to stop, willing to sit beside someone who needs another human being to know that they exist. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And which character stayed with you the most? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.